Chapter 1. An Unexpected Visitor. Miss Jane Marple glanced thoughtfully at the clock perched neatly above the mantelpiece. It was precisely 8 in the morning, and sunlight streamed warmly through the lace curtains of her cosy sitting room. With characteristic calm she smoothed the folds of her soft grey cardigan and turned towards her maid, Margaret, who stood awaiting instructions by the doorway. "Margaret, dear," she said gently but firmly, "would you mind packing my things? I must catch the 2 o'clock afternoon train today. My nephew Raymond's birthday is next week, but the dear boy insists that I arrive today. He's always so eager. He even invited me a whole week in advance." Margaret nodded obediently, her round, rosy cheeks flushed with anticipation of the day's work. "Certainly, ma'am," she replied cheerfully. "I'll start right away." Just as Margaret turned to leave, a hesitant yet persistent knock echoed sharply from the main door. Margaret glanced inquisitively toward Miss Marple, who nodded encouragingly. Quickly, the maid crossed the hall and opened the door. Standing outside was a young boy, his thin frame enveloped in an ill-fitting school uniform, his face pale and apprehensive. His brown eyes, filled with trepidation, darted up anxiously as he asked softly, "May I please speak to Miss Marple?" Margaret, noting the boy's distress, ushered him gently into the sitting room. The boy stepped tentatively inside, and upon glimpsing Miss Marple, tears filled his eyes and spilled uncontrollably down his cheeks. Alarmed yet composed, Miss Marple rose swiftly from her armchair and moved towards him, her frail hands extended in comfort. Now, my dear," she said soothingly, guiding him to the settee beside the fire. "Come and sit down, there's no need to cry. You're safe here." Margaret quickly fetched a glass of water, handing it gently to the boy, who accepted it gratefully. Gradually, his sobs subsided into occasional sniffs and trembling sighs. Miss Marple waited patiently, her gentle blue eyes observing him intently. "My name," the boy finally spoke in a shaky whisper, "is Henry." Miss Marple nodded warmly. "Well, Henry, I'm Miss Marple, and this is Margaret. It's quite all right. Now tell me, from which village have you come?" "Little Hadley," Henry answered promptly, his voice slightly steadier. "Little Hadley," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, her mind swiftly connecting faces and places. "And what brings you to my doorstep, Henry? What has made you so unhappy?" Henry's eyes welled once more with tears, but he bravely swallowed them down, steadying himself. "3 years ago," he began hesitantly, his voice small but clear. "My father went out to work one morning and never returned." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly in sympathy, her kindly eyes urging him to continue. "The police," Henry continued, his voice wavering again, "said my father ran away, that he stole money from his employer and disappeared." His voice cracked at this revelation, his young shoulders shaking with barely suppressed grief and humiliation. Miss Marple exchanged a gentle look with Margaret, both women deeply moved by the boy's obvious distress. "At school," Henry whispered, barely audible. "The other children tease me horribly. They call my father a thief and laugh at me. I couldn't bear it any longer. I skipped school today and came straight here to find you." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes filled with tender concern. "Why me, Henry?" she asked softly, though she sensed the reason. Henry lifted his chin bravely. "I've heard you're extremely kind-hearted, Miss Marple," he said earnestly, his brown eyes meeting hers directly. "They say you help people when no one else will." Miss Marple felt a tug of compassion deep within her heart. She placed her delicate hand gently on Henry's trembling fingers. "Can you tell me your father's name, Henry?" she asked kindly, her voice infused with quiet resolve. "Oliver," he replied immediately, hope glinting faintly in his sorrowful eyes. "Oliver Burton." Miss Marple smiled reassuringly, her expression radiating a calm determination. "Well, Henry Burton," she said firmly, "I promise you that I will do my utmost to help you find out the truth about your father." A relieved sigh escaped Henry's lips, the first genuine flicker of hope lighting his young features. Miss Marple turned gently toward Margaret, who had been silently observing with deep empathy. "Margaret," she instructed kindly, "please see that Henry has something nourishing to eat. He looks as though a good breakfast would do wonders." "Right away, ma'am," Margaret replied warmly, guiding Henry gently toward the kitchen, where comforting aromas already wafted invitingly. Miss Marple remained seated, deep in thought, her fingers intertwined neatly on her lap as she contemplated the unexpected interruption. Her nephew Raymond had always been impulsive and cheerful, his invitations notoriously early, and his enthusiasm boundless. Yet as Miss Marple considered young Henry's poignant tale, she felt a stirring sense of duty pulling gently at her conscience. Presently, Margaret returned, her expression slightly puzzled. "Henry has gone." "Ma'am, I was just about to begin packing your belongings." Miss Marple raised a delicate hand, silencing her gently. Her eyes twinkled knowingly as she smiled at Margaret. "My dear Margaret," she said, with gentle amusement, "Raymond's birthday is still an entire week away. The packing can wait." Margaret nodded with a fond smile, well accustomed to her mistress's sudden and unwavering determination. "Indeed, ma'am," she replied with good-humoured resignation. "I'll fetch your notebook and pen, shall I?" "That would be most helpful," Miss Marple agreed warmly, her mind already piecing together fragments of Henry's story. A sharp intuition stirred within her, sensing a hidden truth buried beneath 3 years of suspicion and heartache. As Margaret left, Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully into the gently crackling fire, her blue eyes reflecting the flickering flames. She knew the village of Little Hadley only vaguely, but experience had taught her that human nature remained remarkably consistent wherever one went. Behind every mystery, she mused silently, were human frailties, secrets, and truths waiting to be uncovered. A faint, purposeful smile touched her lips. Today marked the beginning of a new puzzle, and Miss Marple, quietly determined, knew exactly how to begin solving it. First, a visit to Little Hadley. Then, she thought firmly, justice and perhaps redemption for young Henry Burton. Chapter 2. Unanswered Questions. Early the following morning, the village of Elmsworth lay quiet under a pale, milky sky. A soft mist lingered, brushing the trees and rooftops with dampness, and lending an air of secrecy to the quaint cottages and narrow lanes. Miss Marple stepped carefully onto the cobbled street, a steady determination in her eyes. Wrapped in her favourite blue woolen shawl, she looked like the gentle, kindly spinster everyone expected, but beneath that façade lay a razor-sharp mind, quietly preparing to unravel the threads of a troubling mystery. She had planned to visit young Henry's home promptly, but first, she decided firmly, she must clarify some essential details with the local authorities. Elmsworth's small police station, modest and unassuming, stood just beyond the village square. Approaching the building, Miss Marple carefully adjusted her hat and entered, the bell above the door giving a cheerful yet oddly intrusive jingle. Inside, the room was dimly lit and sparsely furnished, exuding an air of sleepy boredom. A young constable at a battered wooden desk looked up in surprise, hastily setting aside a half-eaten breakfast pastry. "Good morning, madam," he greeted her politely, though clearly curious about the elderly lady's unexpected arrival. "May I help you?" "Good morning, constable," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, her tone gentle, yet authoritative. "My name is Jane Marple. I'm here concerning Oliver, the local man who disappeared about 3 years ago. Perhaps you recall the case?" Recognition flickered across his face, mixed with mild embarrassment. "Ah, Oliver," he said slowly. Yes, I remember him. An unfortunate business indeed. Miss Marple seated herself carefully on a sturdy wooden chair opposite the desk. Could you kindly share what information you have regarding his disappearance? The constable hesitated briefly, glancing nervously toward an older policeman who now appeared from a small office at the back. The older man approached, offering a cautious nod. I'm Sergeant Thomas, he introduced himself briskly, eyeing her curiously. May I ask why you're interested in Oliver's case? Miss Marple smiled politely, but firmly held his gaze. I'm assisting young Henry, Oliver's son. He came to see me yesterday, deeply distressed by rumors surrounding his father's disappearance. I've promised to look into the matter myself. Can you please tell me exactly what transpired 3 years ago? The sergeant sighed, reluctantly lowering himself onto a creaky chair. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, clearly uncomfortable under her direct questioning. 3 years ago, Sergeant Thomas began cautiously. Oliver worked for Mr. Edward Maxwell, who owns the local feed and seed supply store. Oliver was responsible for depositing Mr. Maxwell's weekly earnings into the village bank. However, one afternoon Oliver simply vanished. He never arrived at the bank, and the money, over £300, vanished with him. Mr. Maxwell promptly reported the theft, and we filed an FIR accordingly. And Oliver? Miss Marple gently prompted, her eyes observing the sergeant's subtle shifts in posture. Did anyone ever see him again after he left the store? No, Sergeant Thomas admitted reluctantly, shaking his head. Despite extensive searches, Oliver simply disappeared, not a trace or clue. Naturally, we suspect he ran off, possibly with some woman, using the money to fund his escape. Miss Marple leaned forward, her clear blue eyes calm but incisive. You suspect he left with a woman? Tell me, Sergeant, did any woman vanish at the same time? Any report of a missing female matching such circumstances? The sergeant hesitated, visibly embarrassed. He cast a glance toward the young constable, who silently shook his head. No, he conceded awkwardly. There was no such report filed. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow subtly, her voice filled with gentle reproof. Then how can you so confidently suggest he fled with a woman? Is it not rather irresponsible to speculate without any concrete evidence? The silence that followed her remark was thick with discomfort. The constable shifted uneasily, staring down at the scratched desk surface. Finally, Sergeant Thomas cleared his throat defensively. Oliver, you see, had a rather troubled reputation, he admitted, sounding almost apologetic. He was known in the village to be involved with drugs. It's entirely plausible he took the money, purchased drugs, and fled. Miss Marple nodded slowly, considering this carefully. Yes, I quite understand your reasoning, Sergeant. Such scenarios do occur. However, she paused thoughtfully, her voice becoming firmer. Plausibility and proof are entirely different things. Do you possess actual evidence to support your claim? The policeman, clearly uncomfortable, shook his head again. No, Miss Marple, there's no solid evidence, merely village gossip, and our assumptions based on Oliver's past behavior. Precisely my point, Miss Marple responded quietly, her tone gently corrective, yet firm. Oliver may indeed have made mistakes, perhaps grievous ones. Yet without evidence, you cannot simply dismiss his disappearance as a voluntary act. What if something tragic befell him? The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly troubled by the suggestion. The constable swallowed nervously, his youthful face betraying guilt and doubt. Perhaps, Sergeant Thomas conceded slowly, his tone somewhat humbled. You're right. Perhaps we've rushed to judgment. Miss Marple nodded appreciatively. Then may I strongly suggest you officially file a missing person report for Oliver? I'm deeply concerned that something unfortunate may have happened to him. Both officers nodded awkwardly, their agreement muted by embarrassment. The sergeant straightened, offering a professional, if grudging, acknowledgement. "You're correct, Miss Marple," he admitted finally. "We will indeed reconsider this matter and officially record Oliver's disappearance. Perhaps your involvement will shed some new light on the issue." Miss Marple rose gracefully from her chair, straightening her shawl carefully. Her face softened into a grateful smile. "Thank you, Sergeant. I intend to visit Oliver's family now. I'll return later today, accompanied by them, to ensure the report is properly filed. But first," she paused deliberately, her eyes glinting with resolve, "I will speak to Oliver's employer. May I have the address?" The constable quickly scribbled something onto a scrap of paper and handed it to Miss Marple. "It's Maxwell's Feed and Seed," he explained, "just past the square, opposite the village bakery." "Thank you," Miss Marple replied warmly, carefully placing the paper into her handbag. She nodded politely to both men. "Good day, gentlemen." Stepping outside, Miss Marple drew a deep breath, relishing the cool freshness of the morning. The village was beginning to awaken fully, doors opening, people exchanging greetings. Yet, behind this innocent façade, she sensed something hidden, a shadow obscuring the truth of Oliver's disappearance. With renewed determination, Miss Marple turned toward Maxwell's shop, her sensible shoes clicking quietly upon the cobblestones. She knew from long experience that answers often lay hidden in plain sight, obscured only by prejudice and assumption. Her intuition told her Oliver's story was more complex than the police believed, and she felt an urgency now, a need to uncover the truth not merely for justice, but for young Henry, whose hopeful eyes had pleaded silently for help. As Miss Marple walked purposefully toward her next destination, the morning mist began to lift, hinting that clarity and truth might soon follow. Chapter 3. Beneath the Surface. The morning sunlight had finally broken free of the lingering mist, washing over the village of Elmsworth with quiet warmth. Miss Marple made her way purposefully toward Maxwell's Feed and Seed, Oliver's former workplace, feeling a growing determination to sift fact from fiction. She paused briefly in front of the modest brick building, noting the neatly painted sign above the door and the orderly rows of gardening tools displayed in the windows. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped inside. A small bell jingled cheerfully, and an elderly man glanced up from behind the shop counter, offering her a polite but curious smile. His glasses balanced delicately on the tip of his nose, and he adjusted them with a quick, habitual gesture. "Good morning," he greeted her pleasantly. "How may I assist you today?" "Good morning," Miss Marple responded, approaching the counter with gentle confidence. "You must be Mr. Maxwell?" "Yes, indeed," he confirmed, watching her with interest. "Edward Maxwell, and you are—" "Jane Harper," she introduced herself warmly. "I'm here regarding a rather sensitive matter, your former employee, Oliver. I believe you recall his disappearance 3 years ago?" Mr. Maxwell's welcoming expression immediately grew guarded, his eyes clouded by discomfort. He nodded slowly, his voice lowered, carrying a reluctant, familiar script. "Oh, yes, Oliver. A troubling episode indeed. The police must have already informed you of the details, Miss Marple." "Yes, they did," Miss Marple acknowledged thoughtfully. "However, I always find it worthwhile to hear directly from those involved. Could you perhaps tell me in your own words what happened on the day Oliver disappeared?" Mr. Maxwell sighed and leaned slightly against the counter, evidently choosing his words carefully. "It was a Friday afternoon, Miss Marple. Oliver, as usual, had responsibility for depositing the week's earnings at the village bank. He'd been reliable, indeed exceptionally honest, until that very day. But something was different then. He seemed hurried, distracted, even distressed. I recall vividly that his hands were shaking when he took the money. Naturally, after he failed to arrive at the bank, I reported the matter to the police immediately. Miss Marple listened intently, nodding occasionally to encourage him. You mentioned his honesty, so you never doubted Oliver's integrity before that? No, Mr. Maxwell admitted softly, adjusting his glasses once more with a nervous motion. Oliver had always been dependable, hard-working and above reproach. That's why the entire incident was such a shock. But, he added hesitantly, lowering his voice further, he did struggle with addiction, Miss Marple. That's no secret around here. I fear that day his darker side overtook him, causing him to take the money for drugs and flee. Miss Marple studied the man closely. His concern seemed genuine, but something still felt unresolved. Tell me, Mr. Maxwell, she continued calmly, did Oliver ever confide in you regarding any personal problems or conflicts, perhaps at home or elsewhere? Mr. Maxwell hesitated momentarily, his lips tightening. No, he never mentioned anything personal. Oliver kept his private life very much to himself. If he had troubles, he hid them well. I see, Miss Marple replied gently, recognizing that the conversation was nearing its conclusion. Thank you, Mr. Maxwell. You've been most helpful. Might I speak briefly with some of your other staff? Mr. Maxwell nodded and gestured toward a small room behind the counter. Certainly, Miss Marple. They're in the storeroom just behind me. Miss Marple thanked him and moved quietly into the small, neatly organized storeroom, where two young assistants were busy stacking shelves. They glanced up curiously, clearly intrigued by her presence. She introduced herself and carefully asked them about Oliver. Their responses came quickly, tinged with a sense of genuine sympathy and sadness. Oliver was always decent to us, one of them said earnestly. Yes, he had his troubles. Everyone knew about the drugs. But you know, Miss Marple, he truly wanted to change. He'd told us more than once he was trying desperately to leave all that behind. The other assistant nodded vigorously in agreement. Absolutely, he worked harder than anyone here. Oliver was determined to get clean. I always thought there must have been something else that drove him away. Miss Marple considered their words thoughtfully, detecting sincerity and genuine affection beneath their accounts. It seemed evident that Oliver was more complex than the superficial judgment painted by his boss and the police. Yes, he struggled with addiction, but his commitment to change appeared equally real. Thanking them warmly, Miss Marple stepped back onto the street, her thoughts swirling. Beneath Oliver's surface image, an addict and alleged thief, lay deeper layers, unexplored and overlooked. She was certain now that his disappearance was more complicated than a mere theft driven by desperation. As she headed resolutely towards Henry's home, Miss Marple silently vowed that she would uncover the truth buried beneath the whispers and assumptions, no matter how deeply hidden it might be. Chapter 4. Family Secrets. It was late morning by the time Miss Marple reached Oliver's modest cottage on the outskirts of Elmsworth village. The small house was framed by a neatly kept garden, filled with bright, blooming flowers and meticulously trimmed hedges. Yet, despite its cheerful appearance, a heavy silence lingered over the place, as if the shadow of Oliver's unexplained disappearance still clung stubbornly to its walls. Knocking gently at the door, Miss Marple waited patiently until Oliver's wife, Sarah, opened it. Sarah appeared weary, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, though she managed a polite smile. "Miss Marple, please come in," Sarah invited softly. "Henry mentioned you'd be coming by." Stepping inside, Miss Marple's observant gaze quickly took in her surroundings. The cottage was impeccably tidy but humble, hinting at quiet dignity despite evident hardship. Henry sat quietly at a small wooden table, watching Miss Marple intently, his young face hopeful yet cautious. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Miss Marple began gently. I just need to clarify some matters regarding Oliver. It might help us uncover the truth." Sarah offered her a seat and took her own place opposite Miss Marple, clasping her hands nervously on her lap. "Of course, anything you want to know." Miss Marple paused momentarily before continuing. "Forgive me for asking this directly, but there have been many suggestions about Oliver's struggle with drugs. Could you tell me the truth about that?" Sarah sighed deeply, her shoulders sagging under the invisible weight of the question. "Oliver did have a problem," she admitted quietly. "But he overcame it completely before his disappearance. He fought hard to get clean, especially for Henry's sake." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, noting the sincerity and conviction in Sarah's voice. "Do you recall what initially drove Oliver toward drug use?" Sarah's eyes clouded with hesitation before she began to speak softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oliver had a small general store in the village. It was his pride and joy. He poured his life into that shop. But things changed after his father's death. Oliver's younger brother William insisted the store belonged to him, that Oliver had no right to keep it. There was a bitter dispute, causing Oliver great distress. Eventually, William forcibly took over the shop after Oliver disappeared." Miss Marple listened intently, leaning slightly forward. "Did Oliver ever confront his brother about this?" Sarah nodded gravely. "He did. They had several fierce arguments. Once, William became so enraged he threatened Oliver's life if he tried to reclaim the shop." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Threatened his life, you say? That's extremely serious. Has anyone informed the police about this?" Sarah shook her head. "Oliver didn't want family matters dragged publicly into the village gossip. He tried to handle everything privately." Miss Marple paused, choosing her next words with care. "Sarah, it seems to me possible, even likely, that William may have something to do with Oliver's disappearance." Henry, silent until now, looked anxiously at Miss Marple, then back to his mother. His eyes filled with a painful mixture of fear and hope. "Could Uncle William really have hurt Father?" he whispered. Miss Marple offered the boy a reassuring smile. "We must not jump to conclusions, Henry, but it's important we explore every possibility thoroughly." Turning back to Sarah, she continued firmly, "Tomorrow morning, you and Henry should visit the police station. They've agreed to officially file Oliver's disappearance as a missing person case. This will ensure a proper investigation, one free from assumptions." Sarah's face softened with relief. "Thank you, Miss Marple. We'll do as you say." Rising gently, Miss Marple placed a comforting hand briefly on Sarah's shoulder. "Leave this with me for now. I'm going to speak directly with William myself." An hour later, Miss Marple found herself standing outside Oliver's old store. The shop, now under William's name, was thriving, a stark contrast to Oliver's humble cottage. William stood behind the counter tallying receipts, his stern expression wary, as Miss Marple entered. "William?" she inquired politely. He looked up sharply, nodding slowly in recognition. "Miss Marple, isn't it? What brings you here?" "Oliver," she answered plainly, observing his reaction closely. His features tightened visibly, betraying unease. "I expected as much. Ask your questions, then." Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "Your brother disappeared 3 years ago under troubling circumstances. You threatened him shortly before that disappearance, did you not?" William scowled defensively. "We argued bitterly, yes. The shop had become a sore point between us, but Oliver was still my brother. Family fights happen, Miss Marple. Surely you don't think I harmed him?" Miss Marple watched him steadily. "I think you had a motive," she stated evenly. William flinched, hurt and anger mingling openly on his face. "Yes, I was angry with Oliver. Yes, we argued over this shop, but I did not cause my brother's disappearance. We fought like brothers do, harsh words exchanged in anger, but I swear to you, nothing more." Miss Marple softened slightly. His vehement denial carried sincerity, tinged unmistakably with regret. Chapter 5. Into the Shadows. Early the next morning, Miss Marple walked briskly to the village police station, her determination growing stronger with each careful step. Sunlight filtered gently through leafy branches, dappling the pavement with patches of gold. Yet beneath this peaceful exterior, she knew a dark undercurrent flowed quietly, threatening the harmony of this seemingly idyllic village. When she entered the station, she saw Oliver's wife, Sarah, and his son, Henry, already seated quietly, waiting patiently in the modestly furnished room. Henry glanced up, his young face brightening slightly as Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "Good morning," she greeted softly. "I see you've arrived promptly." Sarah nodded, eyes tired but resolute. "We came as soon as possible. The officers have agreed to officially file Oliver's missing person report." Sergeant Thomas stepped forward, paperwork already in hand. "Good morning, Miss Marple. We'll proceed with the report immediately." As the necessary forms were completed and filed, Miss Marple stood thoughtfully nearby, considering her next move. When the formalities concluded, she spoke decisively, addressing Sergeant Thomas directly. "Sergeant, now that Oliver's disappearance is officially recognized, it might be prudent to investigate the place where he obtained his drugs. Perhaps there we will uncover something useful." Thomas looked surprised, but quickly understood the logic behind her suggestion. He nodded in agreement. "Yes, Miss Marple, that's a good idea. We've suspected illegal activity in that house for some time, but lacked sufficient cause for action." Within the hour, a small team of police officers, accompanied by Miss Marple, who insisted on coming, and Sergeant Thomas, approached a worn-down cottage at the edge of the village. The cottage was hidden behind dense hedges and overshadowed by sprawling trees, lending an aura of secrecy and neglect. Miss Marple observed from a safe distance as the officers moved swiftly, knocking loudly and firmly at the door. Voices inside shouted in alarm, followed by hurried footsteps, confirming suspicions about the nature of activities within. "Police, open immediately!" Sergeant Thomas commanded sternly. Moments later, the door burst open as several men attempted to flee, but were swiftly apprehended by waiting officers. Chaos briefly erupted, with angry protests and desperate pleas filling the air, but the officers soon restored calm. Miss Marple watched carefully as officers emerged from the house, escorting a tall, grim-looking woman and a younger man who appeared to be her son. The woman struggled briefly, angrily shouting accusations at the officers, but they restrained her firmly, placing her beside her subdued and sullen son. Inside, the officers discovered extensive evidence of drug trafficking, stacks of money, hidden parcels containing substances clearly meant for sale, and several ledger books meticulously documenting transactions. The woman stared defiantly, eyes filled with anger and contempt. "Miss Marple?" Sergeant Thomas approached, nodding respectfully. "It appears your instinct was correct. They've been supplying drugs across the entire village, perhaps even farther afield. Oliver?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Was he a frequent visitor here?" The woman overheard and laughed harshly, bitterness evident in her voice. "Oliver? Yes, he came here often, always trying to escape reality. But he stopped coming long ago, claimed he'd found redemption or something foolish like that. Said he wanted to protect his family." Miss Marple considered these words carefully. Oliver's struggle seemed even clearer now. He had indeed changed, fought against his addiction, and perhaps had paid a heavy price for that bravery. "We'll keep the woman and her son here for further investigation," Sergeant Thomas confirmed, turning back to Miss Marple. "We must question them thoroughly." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her thoughts already drifting toward what this new information could mean. With each passing moment, the hidden truths behind Oliver's mysterious disappearance were gradually surfacing, but she knew there was still much left in shadows, dangerous truths that might yet alter the lives of those involved forever. Chapter 6. Behind Locked Doors. As the police secured the house, Miss Marple quietly entered, determined to conduct her own meticulous examination of the premises. The cottage, despite its outwardly ordinary appearance, held an oppressive atmosphere, a lingering presence of wrongdoing that made the air feel heavy and unpleasant. She carefully moved from room to room, observing every detail with her keen, discerning eyes. The interior revealed obvious signs of neglect and decay. Threadbare curtains covered grimy windows, allowing only thin slivers of pale sunlight to filter through. The wooden floorboards creaked ominously beneath her steps, as if protesting her intrusion into secrets long concealed. Every room she entered contained evidence of a troubled life: stained mattresses, broken furniture, discarded bottles, and suspiciously concealed bundles hinting at illegal trade. After methodically examining the upper floor, Miss Marple descended the creaking staircase to the ground level. Here, her attention was drawn immediately to a heavy wooden door, curiously locked and bolted. She paused, thoughtfully observing its rusty hinges and secured handle. Clearly, something of importance lay hidden behind it. Turning back, Miss Marple addressed Sergeant Thomas, indicating the locked door with a subtle nod. "Sergeant, have we examined this particular room yet?" she inquired calmly. He shook his head, clearly intrigued. "Not yet, Miss Marple." The woman who owned the house stood nearby under police supervision, her eyes darting nervously toward the locked room. Miss Marple approached her gently, yet firmly, speaking softly, but leaving no room for argument. "What's inside this locked room?" The woman hesitated, wringing her hands anxiously. "It's nothing, just junk. Old things we never use." Miss Marple studied her face carefully, noticing the tremble of her lips and the flicker of panic in her eyes. "Then you won't object to opening it for us," she said quietly, her voice kind, yet authoritative. The woman hesitated a moment longer, clearly wrestling with her fear, before finally producing a small, tarnished key from her pocket. Her hands shook visibly as she inserted it into the lock. The bolt slid back reluctantly, and the heavy door swung open slowly, releasing a stale, acrid scent that filled the hallway. Miss Marple stepped cautiously into the room, followed closely by Sergeant Thomas and several police officers. What they saw caused them to exchange uncomfortable, startled glances. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the faint daylight slipping through cracks in the boarded-up window. Strange symbols covered the walls, crudely drawn and unsettling in their intensity. Shelves lined the space, cluttered with bizarre artifacts. Black candles melted down to their bases, dried herbs and roots wrapped in cloth, peculiar figurines carved from wood and bone, and disturbing, cryptic inscriptions scribbled upon scraps of parchment. Miss Marple carefully approached a cluttered table at the room's center, where a dusty book lay open. Its pages were covered in handwritten incantations, each page bearing marks of heavy use. Turning calmly to face the woman, she regarded her with quiet seriousness. "Can you explain these unsettling objects?" Miss Marple asked, gently, yet sternly. The woman lowered her head in shame, her voice trembling. "They're for rituals, magical practices," she admitted reluctantly. "I use these things to perform spells, begging forgiveness for my sins." A heavy silence settled upon the room. Sergeant Thomas exchanged an incredulous glance with Miss Marple. "Magic?" he asked skeptically. "Yes," the woman whispered defensively. "I hoped it would protect me and my son from harm, from punishment. We've done terrible things." Miss Marple studied her carefully. Despite her outward bravado and attempts at intimidation, this woman was clearly tormented by guilt and fear. Sergeant Thomas stepped forward decisively. "We'll take you and your son in immediately for further questioning." The woman, resigned, allowed herself to be led away by the police, casting one last frightened glance back at the room she had desperately tried to hide. As the officers departed, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer in the unsettling chamber, thoughtfully regarding the disturbing collection. Darkness had indeed lurked behind this locked door, but the mystery of Oliver's disappearance was not yet solved. Chapter 7. Walls of Deception. After the police departed with their prisoners, an uneasy quiet settled over the house. Miss Marple, however, felt compelled to remain, her instincts sharply alert. Beside her stood Constable Harper, a young officer who watched Miss Marple with respectful curiosity, patiently awaiting her next move. The oppressive silence in the strange room intensified. Miss Marple scanned the unsettling artifacts scattered around, but something still nagged at her intuition. Her gaze slowly drifted around the space until it settled upon the far wall. The wall, partially obscured by shadow and covered with faded paint, appeared subtly different from the others. Its texture seemed slightly off, and its paint fresher, a detail easily overlooked by the untrained eye. "Constable Harper," Miss Marple spoke gently, her voice thoughtful. "Have you noticed anything peculiar about that particular wall?" The constable stepped closer, squinting at the wall critically. "It does seem somewhat different, Miss Marple. What are you thinking?" Without answering immediately, Miss Marple moved toward the wall and gently tapped its surface with her knuckles. A hollow sound resonated faintly, confirming her suspicions. "I suspected as much," she murmured softly, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Constable, this wall is hollow. Something hidden lies behind it." Harper, Hidden lies behind it. Harper, sensing the gravity of her discovery, glanced quickly toward her. "What shall we do, Miss Marple?" She turned decisively. "Break it down. I fear what we find may be most disturbing." The young constable hesitated only briefly before nodding sharply. He fetched a heavy crowbar from among the confiscated tools left behind by the police, gripping it firmly. After one deep breath, he swung forcefully, striking the hollow wall. Plaster and thin wooden boards splintered noisily, revealing a shadowy cavity hidden behind. Miss Marple stepped forward cautiously as Harper continued breaking away the brittle wall, carefully widening the opening. With each strike, a dark space became visible, and a stale, musty odor filled the air. Finally, with the wall fully opened, Harper stepped aside, breathless and pale, pointing toward the hidden recess. "Miss Marple," he whispered, voice barely audible, "there's something inside." Moving closer, she peered into the exposed cavity. Her heart sank at what lay before them, the unmistakable remains of human bones, skeletal fragments neatly hidden, deliberately entombed within the walls. "Oh, heavens," she murmured gravely, stepping back slightly. This poor soul was hidden away here, deliberately sealed within the walls. Harper stared at the bones in shocked silence, his hand trembling slightly. "Who could have done such a dreadful thing?" he asked, stunned. Miss Marple gazed at the remains thoughtfully, her mind working quickly. Someone desperate enough to conceal their crime thoroughly. The constable straightened resolutely. "I'll inform Sergeant Thomas immediately. He'll need to see this at once." "Yes, please do," Miss Marple agreed, still gazing sorrowfully at the hidden tomb. As Harper hurried off, she stood silently, considering the gravity of the discovery. The village's secrets were finally beginning to unravel. Dark deeds once hidden within walls of deception now awaited justice. But for Miss Marple, the haunting question remained, Who among them had committed this terrible act? Chapter 8. Truth Revealed. Miss Marple arrived at the police station late that afternoon, her footsteps echoing softly down the long, tiled corridor. The discovery at the cottage lingered heavily in her thoughts, and she carried herself with quiet solemnity as she approached Inspector Thomas's office. Inside, the woman from the cottage sat stiffly in a chair, her defiance diminished. She met Miss Marple's steady gaze for a moment, then quickly looked away, guilt written plainly across her pale face. Inspector Thomas stood beside the desk, his expression stern, yet thoughtful. Miss Marple spoke gently but firmly, her voice carefully controlled. "We found human remains behind the wall in your home. Perhaps it's time you told us the truth about them." The woman hesitated, eyes darting nervously between Miss Marple and Inspector Thomas. Finally, with a deep, resigned sigh, she began to speak in a low, tremulous voice. "It was 3 years ago. A man named Oliver came to our house to buy drugs. We recognized him from the village, though he rarely came by anymore. That day, he had a large sum of money with him, far more than usual." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "He bought only a small amount, exactly what he needed. He was anxious to leave quickly, but we saw how much money he still had in his pocket. My son and I were overwhelmed by greed. Before he could leave, we attacked him." Her voice trembled with genuine remorse. "It wasn't meant to happen. It was impulsive, reckless, but he fought back. We panicked and hit him again, and then again, until he no longer moved. Realizing what we'd done, we became terrified. To hide our crime, we concealed his body behind the wall and sealed it up. No one suspected us. The blame fell easily on Oliver, given his past." Inspector Thomas listened intently, his expression darkening with each grim detail. Finally, he motioned toward a collection of odd items recovered from the cottage, displayed on the desk before them. Black candles, strange wooden carvings, and cryptic symbols scrawled on parchment. "These things," Inspector Thomas asked sharply, "did you use these in an attempt to gain forgiveness for murdering Oliver?" The woman shook her head vigorously, a bitter smile briefly touching her lips. "No, Inspector. Those were nothing but tricks, items meant only to frighten others and protect our secrets. People feared us because they believed we could use magic to harm them. In reality, the true harm we caused required no magic, only greed." Inspector Thomas exchanged a brief look with Miss Marple before giving a signal to his officers, who quickly escorted the woman away. He sighed deeply, rubbing his brow in troubled contemplation. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he said solemnly. "Without your insistence and careful observation, Oliver's disappearance would likely have remained unsolved." Miss Marple acknowledged his words with a quiet nod. "Justice can be elusive, Inspector, but it often emerges clearly when pursued patiently." Later that evening, Oliver's remains were returned respectfully to Sarah and Henry. Miss Marple stood quietly nearby, offering gentle comfort to the grieving widow and her son, as they tearfully accepted Oliver's bones for burial. Henry held tightly to his mother, visibly shaken, but also relieved that the painful uncertainty had finally ended. Sarah reached out and gently clasped Miss Marple's hand, tears filling her eyes. "We can never thank you enough. Oliver's name can finally be cleared, and he can rest in peace." Miss Marple squeezed Sarah's hand warmly. The truth always brings some measure of comfort, no matter how painful it may be. When Miss Marple returned to her own peaceful home, evening shadows stretched long across the tidy gardens. Her maid waited anxiously in the doorway, watching her closely. "Oh, ma'am," the maid began hesitantly, "are you still planning to visit Mr. Raymond? His birthday—" Miss Marple interrupted her gently, smiling softly. "Oh, dear, Raymond's birthday. It's still 2 days away, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am," the maid confirmed with relief. Miss Marple sighed lightly, smoothing the folds of her shawl thoughtfully. "Then perhaps it's best I leave immediately. Raymond will be terribly cross with me if I delay any further." The maid nodded knowingly, smiling warmly as Miss Marple gathered her belongings. Miss Marple glanced once more around her cosy cottage, then stepped toward the door. Despite the sombre events of the past days, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had finally prevailed, and a grieving family could begin healing. Outside, twilight gathered softly around the village of St. Mary Mead, peaceful once again. Miss Marple walked confidently forward, her heart lifted by the reassuring knowledge that truth and kindness, no matter how buried beneath darkness, always found a way to triumph.